Okay, class, so here is where we need to actually pick up with the endocrine system. So if you can recall, when we were talking about the nervous system, we said the nervous system was the speedy communication. So think of the nervous system like a freight train. It's going pretty quickly. And then the endocrine system is like a cart train, where you're pushing a cart, like a push cart, very slow. So it's a really great video on or within your classroom section for this particular week that gives you what will seem like a simplified understanding of how the endocrine system works, but I assure you it is extremely helpful in connecting that content and making it simplified so that it doesn't seem so complex to understand. All right, so endocrine system. First thing I want you to be familiar with about the endocrine system is, of course, how it's defined. And so you can find that right here in that first kind of little blurb underneath the endocrine system bullet point. It's the slow chemical communication system, okay? Body's slow chemical communication system. That's all I want you to know as it relates to the endocrine system. As far as the definition is what I mean when you see that on your exam covering chapters 2 and 6, okay? Body slow chemical communication system. First thing. Now, what the endocrine system consists of is our glands that secrete the hormones into our bloodstream. All right, so continuing on there, as we start talking about the glands that are secreting the hormones into the bloodstream, let's focus on the different glands, okay? And you can find this information on page 48 within your textbook. So let's start off with the pituitary gland, okay? The pituitary gland is considered the control center gland for the endocrine system, okay? This gland is also responsible for the growth hormone. So that's kind of self-explanatory with us growing. Also, we have the thyroid gland, and I'm going to kind of make note of the glands that I want you all to be familiar with, okay? Thyroid gland. We've heard of thyroid before. That's not a new term, shouldn't be a new term for most of us. This is the gland that affects our metabolism. So you may have heard of a point or time where a person has had issues with their thyroids, and it's because it can cause a person to gain a significant amount of weight because their metabolism is not functioning properly, or it can have a person not have the ability to gain weight because their thyroid gland has been affected and their metabolism is just overly active. And it's like doing too much. So that's there. We have the hypothalamus. All right, hypothalamus, brain region controlling the pituitary gland. The adrenal glands, if you've heard of your having an adrenaline rush, adrenal gland, same difference, okay? It is responsible for secreting the hormone that triggers our fight or flight response, okay? And then we have the pancreas, all right? It regulates our levels of sugar in the blood, testes for the male sex hormones, and ovaries for the female sex hormones, okay? In addition to the areas that make up the endocrine system, I also want you all to be familiar with how hormones are defined. And hormones are defined, and you can also find this on page 48 in your textbook. These are chemical messengers that are manufactured by the endocrine gland that travels through the bloodstream, and then it affects the other tissues, okay? So be familiar with that information. All right, some tools of discovery I would like for you all to, sorry, thought it went on to the next slide. There we go. All right, some tools of discovery that I want you all to be familiar with, and this is as it relates to the brain, okay? Some of them you may already be familiar with. Some of them you may have actually had some of these tools used on you because they can test a lot of different things, because the brain is ultimately the control center. If the brain isn't functioning, then we're not alive, okay? All right, so first up, I want you to be familiar with EEG. All right, EEG is often a tool of discovery as it relates to the brain that is used for sleep disorders, seizures, tumors. And when you're having this, basically what is going to happen is that you'll go in. I've had an EEG done because I have, I suffer with insomnia, and I also suffer with migraines as well. So I had a bit of a sleep study done. And so what they do with the EEG is they place electrodes all over your scalp, pretty much, and they're measuring the brainwave activity. Okay, so that's EEG. The next tool of discovery I want you all to be familiar with is going to be PET scan, and you can find these also on page 51 and 52 in your textbook. All right, and then the next one is MRI. And let me give you a bit of information. My apologies. Let me give you a bit of information as it relates to, there we go. Wanted to make sure we were still on the slide. PET scan, this is where it's going to display the brain activity, but what happens there is that you typically are going to have where it's going to be glucose that is going to be injected, and what's the purpose of the glucose being injected is that the brain is supposed to perform particular tasks by whoever is administrating the PET scan. So based on that, those association areas that should be lighting up in the brain by those given tasks, the glucose is going to allow those areas to kind of light up so that the administrator can actually see if it's functioning properly, if it's not functioning properly, kind of what's going on in that particular area of the brain. But it is a visual display of the brain activity. All right. Next one, MRI. Next and last one is MRI. Okay, the MRI can be done for so many different reasons. Okay. Typically when an MRI is done, the person kind of has to get on the machine, kind of lay flat in the bed, and then they are kind of pushed into the machine where it is surrounding them, loud noise sometimes, but it can actually detect brain tumors, trauma to the brain, MS, stroke, and dementia, okay? And so this was, and oftentimes a person will have an MRI, especially if they've been in a car accident. Sometimes they just do that if it was any type of head trauma, and it doesn't even have to be significant trauma, but if it's any type of trauma to the head, then that's a standard test. But my grandmother, while she was going through, and she passed in December, but while she was going through the process of pretty much being diagnosed with dementia, she had to have an MRI done. And that was able to kind of give a great deal of information regarding her having, she actually had many strokes she wasn't even aware of. She actually, of course, they saw that her brain was shrinking and deteriorating. So really great tool for that. All right, so let's move on to the brain structures. We're going to focus on the brain structures regarding and really this is the older part, so the brainstem and the medulla, okay? And really just gives you the information right here. Brainstem is considered the oldest part and central brain core. It is responsible for the automatic survival functions. And so when they're talking about the automatic survival functions, this relates to controlling the basic body functions such as breathing, swallowing, blood pressure, okay? And you can find that information on pages 53 to 54 in your textbook. And then medulla, we've heard about the medulla. Medulla oblongata is typically what you probably heard it phrased as. But we can call it simply the medulla. It is a part of the brainstem, but it's at the bottom. So that's where it says, that's why it says the brainstem base. It's at the bottom of the brainstem. And it is responsible for controlling your heartbeat and breathing. So as we think back to when we talked about plasticity in class, damage to the brain, you can see how important the brain is overall. And we already know that. But how damage to certain areas is a matter of life and death. Okay? So if a person has significant damage to the medulla, that's it. You know, they're going to die if there's no plasticity in that. If it's significant enough, that's what's going to happen, because that's the part that's responsible for heart beating and us breathing. Okay? All right, let's move on as we continue on. And we have the thalamus. Hope you all are able to see this. Okay, we got the thalamus. All right, so the thalamus is considered the brain's sensory switchboard. All right. And what it's doing is sending messages to the cerebellum, which is responsible for our voluntary movement, and the medulla, which you just saw, that is responsible for heartbeat and breathing. So significant damage to that area, okay, could incapacitate a person or ultimately lead to death. All right. So be familiar with the thalamus. The cerebellum is the next one that I want you to be familiar with, and I just brought it up. But again, all right, it is also considered the little brain because it's also at the rear of the brain stem. And again, it is responsible for coordinating our voluntary movement and balance, and also enables nonverbal learning and memory. So the cerebellum is also impacted or affected when a person drinks or when a person takes certain drugs, okay? Because that area is pretty much being flooded when those chemicals are introduced into the bloodstream, and then ultimately, of course, you know, it starts affecting the brain chemistry. So a person that has drank heavily, alcohol heavily, you know, on a particular day or night, or, you know, whatever the occasion may be, this is why that person can't walk in a straight line. That's why when police do like the sobriety test, a part of it is a person, you know, counting, walking in a straight line and things like that. It is significantly, that area, cerebellum, is significantly impacted by that. Also, the cerebellum, when you begin to look at where it's located in the brain, and you'll see that on the next kind of section of the audio lecture, it's going to be located very close, and we'll see this in chapter 6 as well, very close to the ear. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because if a person has ever experienced vertigo, it's an inner ear issue, okay? But the person with vertigo feels like they're off balance, feels like things are off balance. It's because the cerebellum and the inner ear are like right there by each other in the brain, okay? So those areas kind of go hand in hand when a person is experiencing vertigo. All right, so I'll stop here, and then you will pick up on the kind of latter half of chapter 2.